The sky has been the same shade of gray for 11 days straight. Your fire won't hold a flame past a few minutes. Every piece of stored food is starting to smell wrong. The ground under your shelter has turned into something closer to soup than dirt. Somewhere nearby, a child is coughing, worse today than yesterday. Nobody has seen a clear sky in over a week. There's nothing to do but wait. Okay, so you've probably complained about rain ruining a weekend plan. Maybe canceled a hike. Watched your Wi-Fi flicker during a storm. That's not this. We're talking about rain that doesn't stop for weeks, sometimes years. The kind that shows up in the geological record with its own name, not just a bad Tuesday you're still annoyed about on Friday. So how did anyone survive that? Not one storm. An entire era where the default weather was wet, where dry ground was the exception, where fire and food that isn't rotting, the two things every human body needs, kept getting undermined by the same problem, year after year, with no calendar to tell anyone when it might finally let up. Let's start with what prolonged rain does to a body and a settlement. It's worse than just being uncomfortable. Sustained rainfall wrecks stored food fast. Mold and bacterial growth speed up once humidity stays high. Grain, dried meat, fruit, all of it turns into something that could make you sick instead of keeping you alive, the ancient equivalent of a fridge slowly losing power. Fire gets dramatically harder to start when everything burnable is soaked through. Prolonged wet, cold conditions are a direct path to hypothermia. That threat doesn't require freezing temperatures, just rain, wind, and time working against a body that never gets a real chance to dry out. Rain gets into everything else too. Wooden spear shafts absorb moisture and warp. Animal hide cordage stretches, loosens, sometimes rots through. A community can't just wait out a bad stretch doing nothing. Every piece of equipment needs constant maintenance because rain is actively working to break it down day after day for as long as it keeps falling. Skin problems pile on top of all that. Clothing that never dries. Footwear soaked for weeks. Fungal infections and open sores, which, without modern antiseptics, could turn dangerous fast. Communities develop plant-based treatments for this, applying barks and resins known locally to reduce inflammation. Getting it wrong had real consequences. None of this is abstract. It's the grinding math of survival. Rain refuses to stop long enough for your normal routines to function. It shows up in a community that's slightly weaker, slightly sicker, slightly more vulnerable. Week after week. Reading the sky itself became its own body of knowledge. Wind direction, cloud formation, the behavior of local animals before a shift in rainfall. All of it got noticed, tested, passed down as practical forecasting long before anyone had a word for meteorology. Elders were often the primary keepers of it, the ones who'd lived through enough seasons to recognize a pattern the young hadn't seen yet. A particular smell in the air, a certain stillness before a storm, details too subtle to write down even if writing had existed, passed forward purely through repetition and shared attention. Getting this wrong wasn't a minor miscalculation. Misjudging a rainy stretch could mean rationing correctly, or running out 3 days before the sky cleared. There's a psychological dimension to prolonged rain too. It doesn't show up in the archaeological record the way a granary does. Modern research on seasonal mood confirms what's probably intuitive. Extended low light and constant rainfall measurably affect mood, motivation, group cohesion, not just physical health. A community pushed to its limits wasn't just managing food and fire, it was managing morale, keeping people cooperative through conditions that wear down patience as reliably as they wear down tools. Disputes over the driest firewood, or whose turn it was to check the traps in the rain, likely grew sharper the longer a season stretched on. That's the kind of friction that never makes it into a museum display, but it shaped daily life just as much as any flood ever did. Group decision-making itself likely suffered under these conditions too, tempers shortening the longer a wet stretch dragged on without a single clear day to break the monotony. Here's the part that reframes this problem though. There was an era when none of this was a rare bad season. It was the default climate across an enormous stretch of the planet for thousands of years straight. Between roughly 14,800 and 5,500 years ago, North Africa experienced the African humid period, informally the Green Sahara. The desert you picture today, dunes, brutal heat, no water, was instead a landscape kept alive by rain falling on a scale unmatched anywhere on the continent now. Flowing rivers, permanent lakes, grassland dense enough for herds of large game, rock art scattered across today's harshest desert still shows swimmers, cattle herds, hippos, animals impossible in the modern Sahara, painted by people with no reason to expect the rain would ever stop. Entire generations lived and died there without once experiencing what we'd now call Saharan drought, inheriting a green, rain-fed world as simply how things were. Geologists studying this era didn't stumble onto it by accident. They went looking because isolated clues kept turning up in places that should have been permanently barren. Ancient lakebed sediments. Pollen records showing plants that need real rainfall to survive. Sediment cores pulled from beneath what's now solid desert told researchers something a surface survey never could. Radiocarbon dating pinned down when the wet conditions began and ended, a start and end date for an entire climate era buried under sand that had spent millennia looking like it had never known anything but drought. What did wetter actually mean, in numbers you can feel rather than just read? Researchers studying ancient riverbeds in what's now southern Egypt and northern Sudan reconstructed the actual rainfall intensity of this period. The results are startling. Storm events during the African humid period produced rainfall intensities of roughly 55 to 80 millimeters per hour, 3 to 4 times more frequent than before or after. That's not gentle drizzle. That's flash flood intensity, happening dramatically more often, for thousands of years in a row, in a place people now associate with the driest conditions on Earth. The consequences forced entire populations to move. Communities settled along the Nile found themselves at risk from a river that kept violently overflowing its banks. Rather than staying and rebuilding after every flood, populations relocated to smaller waterways researchers now call fossil rivers. That's an entire civilization reading a landscape. Recognizing the water source keeping them alive had become dangerous, choosing the smaller, safer river over the biggest, most reliable one. Rain didn't just reshape North Africa either. There's a second, more dramatic case of societies undone by exactly this same problem, on a different continent, thousands of years later. Along the Yangtze River in central China, a culture known as Shijiahe built palaces, defensive walls, advanced water management systems, flourishing for centuries on the strength of reliable monsoon rains. Its jade and ceramics industry depended on agricultural surplus, which depended entirely on rain arriving roughly when and how much it was supposed to. Around 3,950 years ago, the monsoon stopped being reliable and started being catastrophic instead. Researchers reconstructed the region's rainfall history by analyzing a stalagmite from Heshang Cave, recording annual rainfall the way tree rings record a forest's history. What they found got nicknamed a rainfall yearbook. It shows extreme monsoon rainfall, some years topping 1,200 millimeters, battering the valley for decades. Farmland sat waterlogged and unusable. Walls built to keep out human enemies did nothing against a sky that refused to stop. The population declined sharply and scattered. The sophisticated culture that thrived there for centuries never fully recovered, its palaces and defensive walls eventually swallowed by the same silt and standing water that had once made the valley so fertile in the first place. Which tells you something the Green Sahara story only hints at. Too much rain wasn't just a regional inconvenience. In the right combination of scale and duration, sustained rainfall could unmake a civilization just as thoroughly as a drought could. Using the opposite mechanism, water instead of its absence. None of this happened only in North Africa and China either. A related pattern shows up in the Indus Valley. Archaeologists studying Mohenjo-Daro found a civilization remarkably skilled at managing seasonal monsoon flooding. Covered drainage channels, gridded streets with deliberate slope, neighborhoods raised on platforms specifically to keep rainwater from destroying homes. For centuries, this engineering worked. Sediment studies suggest the Harappans' ancestors had originally settled in foothill areas because monsoon rainfall there was abundant and dependable, right up until the monsoon itself became the thing that undid them centuries later, as the same rains gradually weakened and grew less predictable. Shelter design changed across all these regions in a way you can trace independently. That tells you something about how universal this problem actually was. Communities in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia built reed dwellings raised above water level as early as 3000 BCE, surviving seasonal flooding driven by rain upstream every year. Across Southeast Asia, bamboo stilt houses became a defining feature of riverine settlements by around 2000 BCE, a design so effective against monsoon rainfall that variations are still standard construction today. Alpine communities in Switzerland arrived at a strikingly similar solution as early as 5000 BCE, driving oak and hazel stakes deep into lake beds to create stable platforms above water. None of these cultures were talking to each other. Separated by oceans, thousands of years, completely different building materials and belief systems. And they all converged on the same basic solution, roughly 10,000 years before anyone invented a group chat to compare notes. Get the floor off the ground, out of the reach of whatever the sky decided to send down that year. Rome took a different approach entirely, one built around moving the water instead of just avoiding it. Starting around 600 BCE, engineers began building the Cloaca Maxima, a drainage channel designed to carry rainwater and river overflow out of a valley that flooded constantly. It started as an open canal following an existing stream. Later, it became a covered stone tunnel large enough for a person to walk through. The engineering worked well enough to turn a marshy, flood-prone valley into the Roman Forum, the political heart of an entire empire. Wooden beams braced the stone walls and doubled as footbridges, letting people cross the canal without getting their feet wet, even during the wettest stretches of the year. It still functions today. Nearly 2,600 years later, rainwater still drains through channels the Romans dug by hand. Fire management under sustained rain required its own hard-won expertise. Keeping a flame alive through weeks of rainfall wasn't about one clever trick. It was layered redundancy, covered hearths, dry tinder stored for emergencies, resinous woods that burned even when damp, a designated firekeeper whose entire job was holding a single coal through conditions that would kill an ordinary flame in minutes. Losing that ember wasn't a minor inconvenience you fixed with a match the next morning. Matches were roughly 10,000 years away from being invented. Restarting a fire from scratch using friction in wet weather could take hours, if it worked at all. Get this wrong, and you lost the ability to cook food safely, purify water, keep predators back. 3 functions collapsing from one failure, cascading through the rest of daily life until the fire was relit. Food storage had to solve the same problem shelter did, just applied to grain. Elevated granaries appear across cultures facing sustained wet conditions. Egyptian granaries from the Old Kingdom onward, roughly 2686 BCE, used raised mud brick platforms, protecting grain from the same Nile flooding that reshaped where people could safely live. Some granary complexes held enough surplus to feed an entire town through a bad season, grain sealed away in chambers specifically designed to stay dry even when the ground around them turned to mud. Rain doesn't discriminate between a person and a food supply. Both had to be lifted out of its reach. Beyond elevation, communities smoked meat and fish over slow fires, cutting spoilage risk even in humid air. They fermented food deliberately, turning moisture into a preservation tool rather than fighting it. Get the timing wrong, and you produce something dangerous instead of something preserved. Not every culture just watched the sky and guessed. In 1441, King Sejong of Korea's Chosun dynasty ordered the invention of the world's first standardized rain gauge, a bronze cylinder called the chugugi. He distributed it to 350 observation stations across the kingdom. Local magistrates measured rainfall daily and reported it to the capital. This wasn't just a clever gadget. It was one of the earliest known systems of organized climate data, over 2 centuries before Europe built anything comparable. Which is really the whole point, buried under the archaeology and the rainfall statistics. Humans facing sustained, punishing rain never found one fix that solved the problem permanently. What they found instead was a layered, constantly refined set of techniques. Elevated shelter, careful firekeeping, raised food storage, smoked and fermented preservation, drainage engineering that moved the water instead of just avoiding it, and the willingness to migrate when even those techniques stopped being enough. None of it made the problem disappear. Sustained wet periods still meant real famine risk when fields flooded out entirely. Still meant disease spreading faster through communities packed into damp shelters. Archaeological evidence from multiple flood-prone ancient settlements shows periods of nutritional stress correlating directly with the wettest recorded years, interrupted bone growth, declining health markers, the kind of evidence that only shows up centuries later but represents real, lived suffering at the time. Survival wasn't a solved problem. It was a constantly managed one, passed down deliberately across generations, about which techniques actually worked and which ones just felt like they should. Every raised granary, every drainage channel, every corner of accumulated weather knowledge represented someone's hard-earned mistake, made once, survived, and never repeated the same way twice. So the next time a rainy week feels genuinely unbearable, that low-grade misery of gray skies and everything staying slightly damp for days, remember that somewhere in your ancestry, there were people who lived through that exact feeling for years at a stretch, sometimes for entire lifetimes. They figured out, piece by piece, how to keep their fire lit, their food dry, their families alive anyway. Some of them left the biggest, most reliable river behind for a smaller one. Some of them raised entire neighborhoods high up onto platforms. Some of them just got very good at building a floor that rain simply couldn't reach. One platform, one raised granary, one carefully tended ember at a time. If your ancestors came from a place with a serious rainy season, drop where in the comments below. Some of the oldest, most quietly impressive engineering in human history was built entirely just to keep ordinary people dry.